Hello and welcome to this game review. So in this one, White got in some trouble because of a misplayed opening, but in a rare case of a blocked position, the position got totally closed off, and even though Black kind of had some advantage, he couldn't really do anything with it. So we have the symmetrical English, and Black went for this kind of Botvinnik setup, which is quite possible, giving up the d5 square for now, but trying to play d5 themselves. And White's job is usually to either play a3 b4 quite quickly to use this bishop on the queen side, or to get the use of this square, for example, by exchanging this bishop for a knight, as well as maneuvering this knight eventually somehow to d5. One route is through f1, another one is e1, c2, e3, and we get some kind of interesting closed strategic positions. Okay, castles, knight g7. And here white plays e4, but this doesn't really make sense if we're playing the symmetrical English. If we're playing e4, our knight on f3 is completely misplaced, which is why black can play e5, because his f-pawn is now movable in this structure, and black's plan is f5, while of course white's plan is kind of f4. But now that the knight is here, he can't really play f4, so the knight is not in a good place. So again, white should basically aim for the queen side when idea is a3. Sometimes white can even sacrifice the pawn like this. This is playable, but maybe not best. Otherwise, d3 is a move. One idea is bishop g5 to try to get rid of the knight on here. Otherwise, simply rook b1 and b4 is an idea. This knight usually goes, as mentioned, somewhere to c2, either to support b4 or to go to e3 and d5. And there's some theory here. If black gets lucky, he will get d5 in, getting a good Maroczy bind. But if white knows what he's doing, he will always be ready for d5. For example, now, if d5, white will be able to take and go bishop e3. And now the point is there is a big threat of knight d4 for a discovered attack on the queen, after which knight takes c6 will happen, which is why black has to move the queen away. And now after rook c1, for example, white is getting some kind of initiative, every move attacks something, and black is still not fully developed, so even though statically black is kind of better, he should not really be in time to get his advantage. But after e4, it seems black is slightly better, castles d3, d6, and bishop g5, and this idea is good when we're fighting for the d5 square, but now when the pawn is on e4, our bishop is not looking at d5, so we can't really get the square on d5, which means this move doesn't really do too much, and black is happy to get the bishop pair. And now queen d2, a6. Black sort of wastes some time. He tries to play on both sides of the board, because again, both sides, since the position is symmetrical, both sides have the same ideas, either b5 and f5 or f4 and b4. So black wants to first get some space on the queen side. He's not really threatening b5 at the moment, but white stops it anyway. The problem with this is that now white will not really be able to play b4 and recapture with pawns. So black's idea was kind of to stop the counterplay here, and then now play f5. Maybe this is not the best timing, but this is kind of the right idea. And here white kind of has to take here, otherwise his bishop on g2 will forever be closed. And with this bishop on g2, when you play the pawn to e4, similar to a king's Indian, you should always be happy to open up this bishop. And now, whatever black takes back with, at least this bishop has been opened. And even though black has this unopposed dark squared bishop, it is not a very good bishop, as the pawn on e5 blocks it, and it's hard to imagine black ever playing e4 successfully. So surprisingly, white is actually slightly better here. Knight h4 is a typical idea to play f4. And if you think about the structure, it kind of looks like a hanging pawn structure after f4 and taking on e5, just kind of a mirror image. We get these positions kind of on the other side of the board, usually. So these pawns are kind of weak. This bishop is quite strong. When white plays e0, rook a1, f4, if f4, then these squares will be weakened. So black's f5 was kind of the right idea, but not the right timing. He should have maybe improved the position slightly before doing all this. But after rook f1, this is a terrible blunder, because now black is allowed to get space on the king side, and after f4, white doesn't really have b4, there's no d4, and there's no f4 anymore, which means white simply has no plan, and he will have to sit and wait for black's attack, which usually should be quite automatic in such positions, but in this game black quite misplayed it. Knight d5, but well, black can just take it, But in this game I decided not to really change the structure. G5 is kind of possible as well. But this did allow b4, which is kind of White's only pawn break. And if he doesn't play b4, then what else is he gonna do, right? So this shouldn't have been allowed, but okay, queen e7. And now h3, not playing b4. h5, black is kind of rolling on the king side, and after gf, black should have really thought about his bishop and taken with this one, after which the game is kind of over because black has this 3-on-2 majority on the king side, which he will use to give checkmate either to the king or to the bishop after g4, f3. Also, this bishop has been opened. Eventually it will have a square here, a target here, and the queen can also use this diagonal eventually. And again, white can't really play d4 as black has good control after g4, and b4 is also hard to play once this bishop has been open. So g4 is coming, and white is basically in a resignable position at this point. But black took with the rook, somewhat confusingly, and now black still has ideas of g4, but now black started completely wasting time. Knight h2 is a good move, trying to remaneuver the knight. Of course, there are some weak squares, so it's not like white doesn't have moves. Now that there's no pawn on f4, the knight can go to e3 or g3. Now a5, and this is kind of a waste of time. The point of black was that he thought he was winning on the king side eventually anyway. So the only chance for white would have been to play b4 for counterplay. So this was tried to not be allowed. But now white finds some good maneuvers, getting the rook to e3, bishop e6, rook g3, and the b6. And the point of b6 was to use the rook without losing the a pawn. Of course, black shouldn't really care about the a pawn, as the f2 pawn is much more important. But again, black mistakenly thought he had an unlimited amount of time because white doesn't have any pawn breaks. But now white finds this idea of provoking this pawn on h5. And once it gets provoked to h4, it means black will not have his only pawn break in g4 available anymore. And if there's no pawn break with g4, then even if black has some kind of positional advantage, he can't really use it because the position will never be opened up. So queen e2 is a good move, and at this point the position is a draw because black can't keep the pawn on h5. Ideally, he would like to play all these moves, rook f8, bishop g5 and g4 to break through, but now it's not really possible. Bishop f7, and here white even could have played for an advantage after bishop f3. Again, if h4, then now white's bishop actually gets to g4. Eventually this knight can go to d5, and this bishop for black is completely terrible, and there will never be any pawn breaks, which means white is likely to play with a better knight against a bad bishop. Eventually, the knight can eventually go here, here, or here, anywhere he wants from e3. Otherwise, rook h4 should be played, but the same situation applies. White's knight is getting some kind of good squares, and black is never really in time to get g4. So okay, knight f1, h4. So black doesn't really have many ideas at this point, and now black can't really do anything with g4, and if there's no g4, he can try to take f2, but that's of course easy to defend. And again, with this structure, there's no pawn breaks. Bishop e6, f3, and even though the engine gives black an advantage, it's only because black has kind of more space and the bishop pair, but objectively it's just a complete draw, and black has no way of making progress here. And even against the computer, you should be able to draw this with white with no real problems. And black just took and offered a draw. White decided to play on, but there's really not much happening here. Even though the computer again prefers black here, there's not really much happening. After h3, white doesn't even have to take it, but he can. The bishop can go back. White can just put all his pieces on the h file, and still there's only one file, so the rooks will probably be traded, and both bishops are terrible, so there's not really much happening. So the rest of the game was kind of some maneuvering. Black did some bluffing to play b5, but it's not really a real threat. For example, if white wastes a move, I don't think b5 is a very realistic chance of playing. For example, a5, this was kind of the idea. Even though white is 2 pawns ahead, his pawns are blockaded, and this bishop might get to d4. But even with the bishop on d4, there's not really much happening. After all, black should be careful to not allow these pawns to eventually advance. So the bishop does have a job anyway. So even here, even though 2 pawns were sacrificed, the engine still suggests it's a dead draw, and nothing is really happening here. So white played quite well after getting a bad position, not allowing f4, gaining space, but it would be best to, of course, take on f5. And in these e4, e5 structures, we can't really allow f4, as then even if we, when we don't have counterplay on the queen side, this should have been kind of one-way traffic for black, but black mishandled it. The better player might not. So hopefully this was useful, and see you next time.